Welcome to this episode of the ZAO Strength podcast. I believe this is episode 15 with the data-driven strength homies, Zach and Josh. We also have Seif Adel, Coach Seif Adel. He stayed up real late for this podcast because he knows the value of intellectual conversations at midnight. It's more stimulating for growth, both physically and mentally. And this episode, we're pretty much just going to be talking about how we feel about training. It's a lot about our feelings and not a lot about facts. It's controversial at best, entertaining at worst. So without further ado, let's introduce the host or the guests, Zach and Josh. I found out today that we went to the same school. So that is surprising, but awesome. How do you guys feel about that?
Go Bucks.
Go Bucks. O-H.
Yeah, go Bucks, baby.
I-O.
I-O. Yep.
So now you guys are in Florida?
Correct.
I think so.
I think so. What's the lifestyle differences between living in Ohio and Florida?
I thought I was going to hate it. Boy, was I wrong. It's so great.
Why did you
The summers aren't as... The summer, I was like, I've never been someone that likes the warm, likes beaches or stuff like that, but
Doesn't
I've
like
changed
being
my
happy.
mind. No, I've changed my mind. The summers aren't as bad as they make them out to be. Like it gets hot, it gets mucky, it gets humid, but
Are you on the
like
west of, like on the west coast or in the center? Where are you at?
it's like southwest.
So you guys get a little bit.
I'm sorry, not southwest.
Southeast.
Southeast part
Yeah, I
of
was
the
going to say
southeast
right?
part of the state.
Towards Miami.
You know
Yeah,
what?
like north of Miami.
I had a dream actually about you guys like a month ago. I don't know how or why, but I had a dream that you guys had like a house and a garage and you had like a train. You had like you had a home gym.
I had that dream too.
I have that dream every day.
And you had like a home gym and you know, I didn't really know how you guys sounded. At least not in my dream I didn't. And I was just like training in your garage and you guys were like, I got to do research. And so I can't talk to you right now. And I was like, come on, don't you want to train with me? And then I remember telling somebody about this and they're like, what the hell? I'm like, yeah, I don't know. I think it's because people send me your stuff all the time that I think about you a lot. So yeah, subconsciously I'm stalking you and my brain wants to know where you live.
How long ago was this dream?
It was like a month ago. It was like recently.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because I think I did.
It's funny because with how crazy the just like increases in rent prices and stuff are around here recently, they're high to begin with down here, but it's just been going up and up. I'm like, all right, what's the next move? So like literally yesterday, I was like thinking, do I want to try to get a place with a garage so I can get a place to train? So,
Really?
Yeah, like literally yesterday.
Wow. Well,
Yeah.
how much is a mortgage compared to rent down there?
That's the question, right? It's like, oh,
Depends where you're at.
you can pay for this like box of an apartment, or you can get like an actual condo or potentially even a house. But then you're like, I don't want to be like a whole adult yet. Come on now.
Yeah. I was talking to my girlfriend about like a house, and at the same time, yeah, it is very adult like, and then you're kind of like, you have a house, and that's where you live now. I guess you can sell it, which is nice. Like, you know, people are always looking for houses, so there's that. But
I'm skeptical.
yeah, yeah. Well, Seif obviously spoke really highly of you guys when he reached out to work with ZAO Strength, and you know, I find that one of the biggest differences between like a lot of coaches in the industry and like I would say the way that you guys think about training and coaching in comparison to no one specifically, but just I would say newer coaches where, you know, you evolve from like the periodization theory books to like, all right, I can coach now. I've done a few competitions to like where you guys are. And I would say RTS, and that's kind of where I come from philosophically, is like you seem to not accept like there's no like truth yet. You know what I mean? It seems like you're still searching for what is like the answer, you know, like how do you really get stronger? Have there been any recent insights on this kind of topic of like, what's the truth to get stronger? You know, people used to talk about volume as like the only thing that ever mattered. back in the day, and they still do sometimes. But where are you guys at in that journey?
This one's hard. I mean, I think if anything, like at least my reading of the research and just like general conversation on this topic is just ever continuously exposed how individual this is, which I think is something we all obviously agree on, both from a theoretical perspective, but also our experience is just going to continuously reinforce that over time. But I think, the academic side of things is coming around to that too. Like, a lot of the periodization theory, early conversations on this stuff is just going to be based on like what we observe with averages. And obviously that's not who we work with. We don't work with, all these data points squished into one imaginary avatar that essentially represents nobody in the actual field. So I think keeping that in mind, and like, I think the major thing is like we become increasingly aware of the limitations of what we do have. And I think that over time shifts the way that you view it and how you utilize that tool. I think is ultimately what it does, is like, it's never going to be useless information. And obviously the periodization theory, that data that informed those ideas exists. And so that understanding probably can help us in some way, but it's primarily understanding the limitations of how all those ideas came to be, that's going to allow us to apply it in the most efficacious way with an updated understanding, is kind of the way that I have sat on this question and thought about it a little bit more. But Josh, I don't know if you kind of think to wrap up there.
No, I mean, it's just like the pursuit of getting inching closer to like the truth, right? And I put that in quotes because like, does that even exist is a question, right? And it's going to vary, is like kind of what got us into this, right? And like research obviously has limitations, whether you think about it from like, like Zach said, hey, we're doing research on the averages. You think about like training status, you think about, hey, they're only, you have constraints in terms of the length of the training program in a study. You have all these constraints, but it's also a really good tool in our tool belt, right? It's one of the best tools we have, arguably the best tool we have. Obviously, we also have observation, and then applying that stuff on an individual level is a whole nother can of worms. So yeah, just say like that question is what got us into this and what got us interested in the first place, and kind of, I guess, what we've been dedicating since we started, or Zach started it, and then we kind of really got rolling with data-driven strength a few years ago.
Well, one more thing to add too, I think that just came to my mind, is like another thing that I think is massively important in this conversation too, is like early periodization theory, or like early just conceptions of training in general, were like almost entirely focused on the physical. And I think our understanding of like the interfacing of the training program on the athlete's entire, existence, the biopsychosocial model is generally the term you'll hear, is like something that I think is increasingly more appreciated now. And I think that to me is an interesting part of the equation, because then it becomes the question of, is like the way that we view training the chicken or the egg almost. It's like, is periodization theory efficacious from a physical standpoint, or is that simply something we've observed from a psychological perspective that included variation for variation's sake in the right intervals of time, generally when people get psychologically burnt out? It just interlaces all of those factors into asking, okay, is it the fact that we precede a heavy block with a lighter block that's slightly higher volume? Like, is that magic? Or is it just simply the fact that we're, again, accounting for a lot of these psychological variation factors that we probably didn't appreciate when those first textbooks were coming out?
Yeah. And one of the things that I actually struggle with is like, I have had so much success with the older, utilizing those models before I started implementing bottom-up training. Like, there was a lot of people that had success with a model. I don't know which one was like the best for everybody, because that obviously isn't a thing. But it
you just pissed off a ton of people.
Yeah, right. I mean, I did, and obviously people have success with it. You know what I mean? Like, coaches that aren't me have success with it. And it is appealing as a way to implement training, because if you have a model that you just think is the winner, you just apply it to everybody, and hopefully enough people run it that you got some successes from it. But as a coach that is like super neurotic about the reasons for why I'm doing what I'm doing, I found it really difficult to like obviously pick a model because it's clearly, like you mentioned earlier, a lot of these models are based on the averages, and I'm working with people that if the averages were working for them, they probably wouldn't be reaching out to me for coaching. You know what I mean? Like they wouldn't say, "Hey, man, what I've tried before isn't really working, or it's working but not very well." I'm not going to go, "Oh, cool. Well, have you tried?"
Just train harder.
Yeah, like train harder. Like, hey, have you tried the DUP? You know what I mean? Like, and so I found that difficult because, I mean, it's not that difficult for me to make the decision. It just makes it really hard to do my job because taking those models away as just like options, it's like, all right, now we got to really fine tune all of the options and like funnel it for this person so that everything, you know, psychologically, the biopsychosocial model works within their training. And like, even when like Seif and I were talking about it, because I think you guys had more of like a periodized approach with Seif, and Seif was like, well, you know, this is new. Like you're going to do the same thing every week for 6 weeks straight, you know? And Seif, you can talk about this for a second, but what was your like first taste with like the bottom up approach? Like what did that feel like for you?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't really different, but the thing is, I really hated doing like long blocks, like 6 weeks or 7 weeks blocks. And what we find, me and Jim, that I usually respond, or that I usually peak after 3 weeks because I tend to overshoot, to be honest. So, but what I can agree on that adaptations takes time. So if I did a 6 week block, for example, maybe a hypertrophy biased block, and after that I did another 6 week strength block. So it's a total of, I guess, 14 weeks, including the deloads. And with Jim, I was doing maybe 3 week blocks and 1 week pivots. So maybe, I don't know, 4 blocks or 5 blocks. I may get better results with the bottom up approach, but usually it takes time. So when I say I peak in 3 weeks, I don't usually hit a PR, maybe an RPE PR, maybe a rep PR, but it's not usually a heavy single, maybe a triple at a 6 RPE or a set of 5, for example, depending on what we're doing. And we kind of building that momentum through the blocks till we do like our best block where we usually have a PR or something.
Yeah, and I found that like people have a tough time with it initially because I think the increased demands on like the autonomy of the lifter, like it increases autonomy when the way that the program is going to be built is based on not only how they're responding, but also how they're communicating their experience with the training. And sometimes I really don't know what my job is because it's like, hey, how did that feel? And then I really dig deep and it's like, well, are you feeling like the doubles are feeling good? Do you think that this dumbbell bench press is feeling good? And they're like, aren't you supposed to tell me what's better? And it's like, well, yeah, but I'm also like, you know, there's this balance between like kind of consulting and then like making a training decision for somebody. And for the most part, I kind of have an idea of like when I need to be doing more like directive decisions and more like consulting. And typically, you know, it's lifters with more experience. I can do more consulting based coaching. And then the newer lifters, I'm like, all right, here's a pretty good set of, you told me your constraints. I think I know what to start you with. And then I'm like, the phase of our coaching is going to shift into more of a consult role. Or the analogy I like to use is I'll be more of the navigator and you now control the ship. Do you guys, like, how do you guys make that decision? Obviously, I'm talking about Zach and Josh simultaneously, so it's difficult with dual podcasts. But when you are making a decision like how to program for a lifter, like, when do you choose, you know what, we're going to use a periodized model that like I enjoy, or we're going to start from scratch here and build it up for you?
I think this is one thing I've like really come to terms with recently is that the kind of like the philosophical approach of training. I used to think like, depending from what position you're sitting. So if you're sitting from like a background of like a periodized training and you're looking at bottom up, you may view that, like, for example, people talk about time to peak, for example, is like, you get somebody from like a really muscle centric academic background. They're probably skeptical that that's like an inherent quality of somebody, depending on the training design. Is that influenced by how much volume you're doing? All those kind of things. So they may be viewing that through their lens, and vice versa. Someone from a bottom-up approach may be viewing a top-down approach from their lens. And the thing that I've started to like come around to is that I think some of those constraints are more so features rather than bugs. And then the way that you view those is kind of contextual to the actual person at the way they use that. So easy example is like, for the longest time, I've talked to Mike about this too, and it's just funny to look back on. I was like pretty skeptical of like the time to peak thing. But the more that I thought about it, it's like I was coming at that from a top-down perspective, like physiologically, this probably doesn't seem to make sense. But what I eventually realized is like, it doesn't matter why it happens. If it's happening, that's an observation that is occurring, regardless of what is the causal factor there. And so what I generally believe that to be is a psychological kind of expectation that, for Seif, every third week, I'm going to have a positive performance. And so what that allows us to do is, when you can kind of view things from an internally consistent model rather than from the lens of the model that you may be more comfortable with, I think that allows you to kind of expand your perspective and realize that probably all models can be used efficaciously, and it's probably more so dependent on the athlete and what they would feel most comfortable with. Like some athletes probably are going to, like a little bit more variation in the weekly structure for whatever reason. Some people probably are going to really, really buy into the clarity that a more bottom-up system in a strict sense can probably provide you. And I think the other thing too that I'm sure Josh is thinking, because I know this is something he likes to bring up a lot, is that they're probably not on a binary either. You probably can have these two things that occur much more in a spectrum. And so like the way that I usually like to conceptualize it for myself is like, you can probably have a bottom up system more so on the block or the cycle level where you're still using a lot of the same concepts. We're just probably using different information that we prioritize to have our starting point. But ultimately, like I said, I think the most important thing to me is not to try to critique a system from an outsider's perspective. Try to understand it from the internally consistent perspective first, to which then you can have critiques from an outside one. But I think understanding that, things may happen for reasons other than you would generally prioritize is really important. And I think that goes the same thing for kind of a bottom-up approach, thinking that all people that use periodized frameworks think there's this magical sequential, property phase potentiation of variables, which a lot of us probably don't hold to that anymore. Kylie's papers, awesome, writing on that, talking about a lot of the gaps periodization, but nobody does the block periodization anymore, where it's only 10s for 5 weeks, only 5s for, X amount. I think very, very few people are probably doing quote unquote periodization that way. And I would view it much more as like periodization to me, or, sequentially changing variables in a way that's, somewhat frequent, is way more of a psychological tool than anything. And rather than it being some magical, sauce that's everybody's going to, respond to the exact same way. So that would be my answer. But Josh, I don't know if you got anything else.
Yeah, I can chat for a little bit while Jim goes and gets a baseball cap.
Dude, I don't even have one. I just, whatever is happening, I thought I did one movement.
Is it from the headphones?
Yeah, it's from my headphones. I wear them too much. So hair just moves
Every time
around.
You can give me any extra you got, bro. I'll take
So
it.
funny, dude.
Every time I get a haircut, they're like, "What is that divot on your head?" I'm like noise canceling headphones, my friend. They will change the way you work.
Yeah, I haven't got a haircut in like two and a half months, so I need to go like tomorrow probably. But yeah,
if anybody's listening, it's because Jim's hair is going crazy.
Yeah, right.
I just realized some people were probably listening and
right.
like, what are you guys talking about?
True.
Yeah, follow us on YouTube, ZAO Strength.
All right, just one quick thing to add, and then I'll be curious to get your guys' thoughts. Like, I think the longer we or the more experience we gain working with athletes and just having more conversations like this one, like the longer we do this, the more charitable we kind of become in terms of like different perspectives. And you realize that like basically everyone is extremely reasonable in their approach. Like you can easily strawman the time to peak concept. What do you mean my muscle has a counter inside of it telling me exactly when, I'm going to hit my best lift? Like you can strawman it so hard, but then you start to understand it makes a lot of sense within the way they do things, right? So like in Seif's example, within kind of maybe the constraints you use, Jim, right? Or the way you set things up, you observe this and is that like the truth with a capital T? Maybe not, but it doesn't matter because within your system, that's what it is, right? Maybe if I ran across that, right, like I would say, hey, we might benefit from having like longer blocks for whatever reason. So I'm going to use like some load constraints, right? Or just prescribed top sets, and then take those off at the end of the block. And then maybe within that system, you observe that the quote unquote time to peak or whatever you want to call it is longer. Is that approach right? Is that approach wrong? No, it just is what it is, right? And again, it's easy to just like stand on the sidelines and say that something doesn't make sense. But then again, most people are pretty reasonable when it comes to the way they actually do things on a day-to-day basis.
This episode of the ZAO Strength podcast is brought to you by the coaches at ZAO Strength. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support us, consider following ZAO Strength on Instagram and sharing this podcast with your friends. We are excited to announce a new coaching service called Self-Determined Coaching. Have you ever wondered if there was a better way to solve training problems, bust through your plateaus, improve your technique, and reach your powerlifting goals? With Self-Determined Coaching, you will gain access to over 30 custom, fully modular training programs designed to help you gain strength, build muscle, and hit PRs at your next powerlifting meet. We also offer a hands-on coaching service called Adaptive Coaching. Adaptive Coaching is an iterative approach to athletic development that helps our athletes get stronger with fewer headaches. Instead of betting your entire long-term success on just one training style, adaptive coaching allows us to build a unique lifting profile for each athlete based on their ever-changing needs and material conditions over time. Adaptive coaching is designed for the strength athlete who wants more from their coaching experience. If you are an athlete who wants to maintain your training autonomy and you want to make training decisions alongside your coach, as well as understanding the what and the why of your training process, then adaptive coaching is perfect for you. On the other hand, if you love to tinker with your training, have ownership over each part of the training, but would like some assistance here and there through guided form checks and self-coaching calls, then Self-Determined Coaching is available now at zaostrength.com. And without further ado, let's get back into the episode. I find that like studying and understanding periodization from a observational perspective at minimum is useful because it gives you kind of I like to view it as like a tool, the whole thing as a tool, and just knowing that you can, like for example, especially more advanced periodization studies on like daily undulated periodization. I mean, most programs have daily undulations in their rep scheme and are probably training a few different energy systems at once, and now we have data that's effective. Cool, that's a tool to use. In particular, I have a lifter who's experiencing this really weird injury where like their bench arcing on their bench press is like bothering their neck. And they have a competition coming up, but it's like in 4 weeks. And we only just today managed to have them do competition bench pressing. We're doing like feet up bench. They recovered pretty quickly, but like it was painful to just arc at all, let alone having weight on them. And today they did 6s at 7 on their competition bench, and they felt good. It was like 105 kilos. It was reasonable weight, I was like, cool. But also, how often can we do this until we increase the inflammation or the pain experience again? And you have a competition coming up in 4 weeks, and we know that typically as competitions get closer, our sensitivity to training increases. And like if something bad happens, typically people are more sensitive to that. So maybe we should use a periodized approach to the next block. Whereas typically it's like, all right, we're doing 3s and back off work. It's structured like this. I told her on the call today, actually before this, I was like, hey, how about we do 5s, 4s, 3s, 2s, and 1s. Basically, it's like this week we're gonna try some 5s to like 7, 8. Next week we'll do 4s, 7, 8, like to amplify the intensity and also to cap the cap the absolute intensity, but then maintain the idea of like graduated exposure, which is helpful with like pain science and also cognitive behavioral therapy, whatever, and or exposure therapy, sorry. And so she was like, yeah, cool. That's great. We have been working together for 2 years. I've never once suggested that. Like, but that makes sense. Like,
maybe.
Why would I just give you doubles just because you happen to respond well to that in the past when you clearly have an injury we need to work around? And I also don't want you to only do 5s for 4 weeks. You know what I mean? So I find that to be really, really helpful when thinking about periodization from as a tool. The other thing I wanted to come back to is what Zach said about, I actually don't know the quote, so you'll have to tell me again, but what it made me think of is something that Mike always said, is that systems drive behavior. And this is something that I think I'm a lot more, I don't know if edgy is the right word, triggered, I suppose. Because that concept I agree with, because I do think that the system will drive the behavior, whether it's, you're talking about an economic framework or you're talking about how a coach operates, their business. Anecdotally, utilizing a bottom-up framework and then implementing periodization into that framework if needed has provided me with a lot more like hands-on, collaborative, and a more difficult coaching experience, but more successful in that sense. Like every lifter is getting a high level of communication from me, because it actually is, my coaching style is dependent on that communication. Whereas when I was predominantly using periodization models and then adding, customization into the model, I found it much more difficult, especially when like I'm busy, to significantly impact training in a meaningful way, like each week or something, where it's like, hey, this is a fully customized program. Like no one of my other lifters are using this. But now, and Josh, I think you posted a post. I keep looking for it because I'm trying to show people it actually, where you start with a lifter with their program and like you're showing how over time the variability in their blocks gets smaller, because you start.
If you look on Zach's page, you might have better look.
Oh, is it on Zach's?
I think that was.
It was like a graph, right? Where like at the beginning, you're starting with a lot more variables and you're trying to figure out which of the variables you're working with will succeed for the lifter. And then over time, like changes from block to block become smaller because you're kind of dialing in the things that work. And that's like at the core, bottom up training, for me. It's like, yeah, at first it's a lot like, hey, we need to talk. We need to figure this out, because if you don't talk to me, I don't know what's working, and I'm not going to assume it either, because I have done that in the past and got burned, and it's not a good time. So anyway, like, what do you think about this idea about the systems drive behavior? Because I do get upset in a sense that like coaches really will do this volume based, one-on-one coaching, but it's like 70 lifters, and I guess from a profit perspective or whatever, like, yeah, sure, do that if you can handle it, if the lifters are satisfied. But I could never take on 70 lifters doing bottom-up training. I think I'd probably cap out at 35, 40 if I'm just, 6, 7, 8 hours a day coaching. What do you think about this concept? And I'll back off emotionally.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Quick, Jim, because I'm curious. So when within like a bottom-up framework, or at least the way you apply it, my understanding is you kind of have like a given microcycle, right? And then you repeat that microcycle more or less until it doesn't work, right? And then once you kind of figure out that point at which it doesn't work anymore, then you can proactively, pivot or deload or whatever the case may be. Do you ever get into like sunken cost in a scenario where like you're in a given block and you're not to that endpoint of the block, right? But for some reason it's pretty clear you should change course, right? You should, or maybe I shouldn't say pretty clear. Like you should arguably change course, right? Like a programming change is probably a good call. or maybe there's psychological considerations, et cetera, right? Do you ever get sunken costs in the sense of, oh man, we're already 2 to 3 weeks in. If we finish it out, we'll at least get that training data. Because I think that your perspective there could lead to an interesting conversation in terms of the pros and cons in like an approach we take, in which maybe on a week-to-week basis there are fluctuations in volume due to like the periodization scheme, as opposed to a more steady approach like you guys use. I don't know if that made any sense. But
Yeah, it does. It does.
Cool.
I would say more often, not more often than not, but like more often in my coaching, like in the last 2 years. So I've been using a bottom up system strictly, I think since 2018. So almost 4 years. I'd say in the last 2 years, I'm much more comfortable with just ending it, and pivoting early than in the first 2 years. Because when I learned about it, both Mike and I and the RTS, like kind of were trying to figure out like what's more important, running it to the end because training data, or pivoting early and sacrificing some data, but increasing the likelihood that the lifter sticks with you. And like, I definitely lost a bunch of clients early on, not a bunch, but a handful, a noticeable amount, where it's like they were telling me something that was indicative that the training just wasn't enjoyable or satisfying or producing results. And I was like, yeah, well, let's take it out. It's like, well, let's go another 2 weeks because you're not fatigued. You're just like not having fun or whatever. And I suppose it probably felt pretty dismissive on that end, because like they probably know their body pretty well. And if they're not enjoying training, I imagine that it's not going to produce a good outcome at the end. And at the time I thought, well, if the training outcome is positive, then they'll have more buy-in. We just need to like keep going. It doesn't work like that, because usually they know if they like the training style in the first week or two, and if it's going well, whether they're getting stronger or not. Like most lifters have an idea if they're going to be stronger by the end of the block, right away. Whereas if it's like I hate showing up to the gym, but I'm getting the training in, that's different. You know what I mean? And so I'd say that I understand kind of like the limitation of, if bottom-up training is when you just run the training block out until it's supposed to end, there's a huge flaw there, because then it's actually a bottom-up training implementation within a top-down management approach, right? So, and that's actually one of the critiques that I have of how some people implement like top-down or bottom-up training. It's like, it's no longer bottom-up if when a lifter is talking with you about their experience, you're ignoring it because you have to follow the bottom-up model. It's like the whole point of a bottom-up model is that the model evolves with the lifter. So maybe this isn't Mike's fault, but whenever someone says here's a way to do something, people usually hear, this is how you do something. And so as my own, younger self, that's how I kind of thought. Like, well, Mike said this is how I should probably do it. I don't know much better. This is brand new to me. I was really stressed out when I first started doing this, because all of a sudden increasing my communication by like 4x per lifter. You want me to do all of this? Like, I'm just going to have him run it out. You know what I mean? So yeah, long story short is, as of the last 2 years, I'm much more comfortable just ending it. And typically that means I got to get on a call with them though, because if we have to end something short, that means I missed something in our communication. I missed something on the call. Maybe they didn't communicate like a limitation that they had. For example, like if a lifter's working with me and they're really not enjoying the gym that they go to, like it doesn't have enough equipment, but they've been convincing themselves that like, it doesn't matter, I can train at this commercial gym, I'll be fine. And then I give them all their program, and like they just still not something hasn't improved. Sometimes I'll have a call with them and I suggest like, hey, maybe we join a powerlifting gym and see if that produces kind of a better environment. Because like I find that environment is huge for lifting. I mean, whether it's me streaming on Twitch or me or them or whatever, training with like-minded people, the program can't do it all. And so usually in those scenarios, it's like, I'm always going through, is it the program? Is it the individual psychology of lifter? Or is it how they're interacting with their lifts? And then it's like, I'm way more comfortable pulling back and reassessing in that scenario.
Yeah, that's really insightful. And kind of the reason I asked that is because I actually think we can run into that as well. And this gets into probably, to circle back to what you actually asked us, Jim, like how they really can be integrated, right? And just that maybe we have perhaps more moving parts, which does come at a cost, potentially, in terms of like diagnosing exactly what's going on, or I'll use that term diagnosing loosely, maybe just observing what's going on, because sometimes I'll get in that as well, because like, hey, here's this training block, right, and this training block features 2 ramp up weeks, right? I view that similarly to like, this is something I want to assess the response of. So like, I think maybe that can be helpful for the listener in seeing that like, even though we incorporate some aspects of like top-down periodization of biasing training towards muscle growth, then biasing training more so towards top-end strength, like we still use constraints or principles of bottom-up periodization, in the sense of like the periodization itself is a variable that you're trying to individualize, right? And I can definitely relate with what you outlined, Jim, in terms of like you get that sunken cost of, hey, we're already in it. And that's just like, you're going to mess up sometimes, because I've run into lifters where like we just don't hit PRs until we actually do a taper at the end of a cycle. And if you never get to that, you're never going to notice that, and then you can't set your expectations accordingly. So sometimes you have to do that, and we're often like, it's that fine line, right? But other times you want to make sure that the client is engaged and bought in. So anyway, that's kind of where my head went in terms of the top down versus bottom up stuff. But Zach, I don't know if you want to answer the actual question that was posed.
All I was going to mention is just an observation, like the last few minutes of us talking. And I think the thing that just gets forever more elucidated to me, that like all of this is ultimately just trying to give us a cohesive system to make systematic change. I think that is by far the most important thing that all of this is attempting to do. And so like Jim was saying, I forget the exact quote now too, but the quote is in my head conceptually. Models drive behavior, I think or systems drive behavior maybe. I think it's totally, that makes perfect sense to me, because I think like a coach's personality is probably going to provide them an inclination towards one of these systems. I would say, us being slightly more academic, probably, found the periodization stuff a little bit more, I don't want to say enticing is probably the right word, because we were probably young and naive and didn't understand how that fit in the greater picture, but that's probably how we started. And then everybody makes modifications to their model to get to, like I said, the fruit of all this, and the thing that is actually trying to be established is systematic change. And I think going back to what you guys just talked about, I think one of the most important things that I have continuously come back to, and this might be the post you were talking about, Jim, is trying to make training as reliable as possible. And what that comes down to, in my mind, from a practical perspective, and this is going to get integrated into a periodization model, this is going to get integrated into conversations with an athlete about designing a bottom-up microcycle, literally all of it, is trying to make sure that the actual program design is realistic enough to get repeated at an interval that you can actually make those changes to. So that means the training loads, the RPEs, the psychological approach to the actual protocols, all of that is tailored to a point that Jim doesn't get, messages from all of his clients on the second week of a developmental cycle every single time. Hey man, I don't think I can do this. And that can be from an overly aggressive training perspective. That can be not accounting for an athlete's preferences and exercise selection, top set, protocol type, all that kind of stuff can literally play a factor into all of this. And so I think that to me is really the nugget of truth to all this that we're ultimately kind of coming at from two different ends, is that you find a system that allows you to make systematic change in one that fits with your priors. I think the slight difference in style probably comes largely on the information that we're okay assuming, because we all assume something. It's just what what prior beliefs do we hold that we're probably a little bit more okay assuming? In our case, maybe that's some of the second order effects that probably can't be accounted for perfectly in a bottom up system, such as, muscle growth potentially potentiating strength gain, things like that. We can't totally prove that in an athlete's training because what's responsible for the effect, the second order effect or the actual training they're doing? That's something you're really never going to be able to purely establish. So that's an assumption we're making. And there's probably assumptions on a bottom-up model as well. And it just depends on which one of those you're willing to draw the line in the sand. And then from there, once you have certain constraints, again, doesn't totally matter what those constraints are, we can start making those systematic changes that get us closer to the place that we ultimately want to be.
Yeah. I want to add something, but Seif, do you have any thoughts on this perspective? Because you're kind of, you've been working, you've had some opportunities to work with some lifters and like help them get pretty strong. I think one of your recent lifters had like all-time PRs at his meet. How do you integrate that, being coached by data driven for a while and like understanding like the differences in this? Like you're kind of like the in-betweener, because I've been on this ship for a while, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I guess there are a lot of similarities that people don't understand. Like when you were talking about starting with a set of fives and fours and then a triple and a double, actually Josh used to do that with me because I tend to overshoot on singles. When I did bottom up training, I guess I told Jim that I usually overshoot with singles, so we started with triples at 7 RPE. So 3 weeks dev block, a triple at 7 RPE is basically 2 in 2 weeks in the first week with Josh. In the second block, we did doubles or singles. I actually can't remember. So if you look at it, it's basically the same, but with different settings in general. And also one of the things that I guess me and Josh talked about, like sometimes when you do an into week and you kind of increase volume and intensity through the weeks, sometimes with a bottom up approach, you kind of tell the lifter, maybe on the first 2 weeks, don't be aggressive with the top set, maybe undershoot a little bit. So if I program maybe a double at an 8 RPE, maybe the first week it's a 7.5, second week it's a 7 RPE, maybe the same weight but faster, and then I go with an 8.5 RPE where I usually peak. So if you look at it, it looks the same, but it's not really intended to be the same. So I guess there are a lot of similarities on how we implement stuff in general. And I guess I enjoy both. Like lately I've been having a problem with top sets in general. And I decided to run a block with a percentage based block. And I did that for 6 weeks, I guess. And then I did a bottom-up block with singles and with percentage-based back-off. And it paid off. I'm actually hitting PRs at 6 RPE. And I only add 5 kgs on my singles. And I'm not even hitting the 7.5 RPEs that I'm programming. So if you look at it, solving that problem that I usually got tired from top sets in general, I'm not doing bottom up, I'm doing a percentage based block, which is basically a periodized block followed by singles with some backoffs, repeating the same stuff every week. And I'm actually responding very well to those two blocks back to back instead of doing only bottom up blocks or only periodized blocks. So I don't know if that makes sense mixing both. I don't know. What do you think?
I was just gonna chime in real quick because like kind of knowing Seif that you were kind of helped out by both these guys, that to me I think one thing is that I was going to highlight, like you said, that the approach to the bottom up cycle can be slightly more in the kind of the periodized direction, but then also I think the way that at least I do things, Josh, I think you're similar, is like the periodization strategy that I use is like moving very few pieces and almost entirely it's top set prescription for the most part. So like to anybody that's like not like intimately focused in these details like all of us, like they would say it's the same training every week too. So I think that's like important to realize that one thing, when given the same information, like Seif's kind of, things he struggled with, things he liked, things he enjoyed, it seemed like you guys were coming to almost the entire exact same conclusions. It's just about navigating what is the best recipe to make sure that he can, adhere to what he needs to do to ultimately be successful. So I find that interesting, first of all. But I also just think like, at the end of the day, I think we're way more similar than we are different. And it's just the conceptual framework that we're ultimately applying to it. It's like slightly different, but it's ultimately leading good coaches to the same places. That's what it ultimately ends up looking like to me.
Well, and especially because you're both, it sounds like we're both like actually caring about how the lifter's responding. And that's why I said earlier, I don't know if I caught it on the episode, but people will send me your posts and I'm just like, yeah, you know what I mean? Like, yeah, agreed. You know, I'm not like, oh my God. And you know, and I've known that like you guys have more of a periodized like framework, but it doesn't seem to be like, you're not like, all right, guys, the best periodization model is block periodization. You know what I mean? It's not like 2010, 2013 stuff anymore. So it doesn't seem to matter. However, I'm just thinking about this while Seif was talking. The rationale to, for example, have one microcycle repeated is literally just one way to build the bottom up. You know what I mean? Like, it's just like the clearest, from what I can observe, the clearest way to ensure that the variables that we're utilizing are eliciting a certain response. Because you mentioned earlier, Zach, that we're just trying to allow for systematic change or more predictability with the lifter, having a predictable response. And like, I just thought, you know, I've realized, like, you know, there's not really a reason not to periodize, and I might even be inhibiting. When I say periodize, what I really just mean is adjusting more variables each week versus just waiting till the end of the block to change course. Exactly. Yeah, so I guess it's really helpful to kind of hear this perspective because one, I haven't heard it before, and two, I actually was talking with Matt Vina last week, 2 weeks ago, because he's really an underrated lifter from Canada. If you guys don't know, check out the podcast. It came out earlier, but he's like wicked strong. You know, I don't know. I think he's like 100 kilos or something. He's deadlifting over 700, squatting, I think, over 700. And his bench is strong. I don't know what his bench is at, but he's like really strong and like really just vibing with his training. And so I asked him what he does, and he's like, well, I just run like, I really enjoy like how Chico structures his training. And so what I've learned from Mike about these types of conversations, because when I started with him, I was very much like, I can't believe you think Chico is good. Don't you know that like low intensities are dumb? Like 531 is for beginner, like 531 is for advanced lifters. How could you ever give that to a beginner? Like, that's how I would talk. And Mike was like, well, what if you could learn something from these approaches? Like, surely there are people that are responding well to 531. There's a reason that they're really excited about it, right? And I'm like, yeah, the reason is because they're dumb. I actually think I texted him that one time, and he was like, okay, I think this is gonna take more work for this guy to get it. But now, of course, like, I've worked with enough lifters over the course of the time, and like, it doesn't seem to make sense to be too dogmatic, because ultimately I just want it to be something we can rely on. And so if, for example, like Chico's training approach is something that is appealing to a lifter, yeah, I mean, realistically, there's not even too much variation between his training. It really is a lot of like the top set loads, and then he's got some different like 5% adjustments with their volume. But Matt kind of combined, like, I think he does like a double at an 8, and then like 8 doubles at 70% or something on his squat. I don't know. And it's like, I wasn't approaching that conversation like, well, are you periodizing it though? You know, like, I don't care. Like, it's actually really cool that you're getting strong that way, because now I might have to build a program that utilizes these types of blocks. Mm-hmm. It's also really difficult to like write a training approach for like 20 people at once, for example, with a bottom up approach, because you have to guess when their time to peak is going to be, you know, and you have to try to manage that. And I still don't really know how people do it with periodized models, to be honest. At least one program for 100 people. So I'm still like, that type of thing is still hard for me. I think when it comes to working with people one-on-one, as long as like athlete response is still kind of the driver for a lot of the decisions, whether you periodize it or not, or you like Josh said, bias the training towards more hypertrophy versus strength at certain periods in time, like, whether anyone cares, that's fine with me. You know, like, because I just mostly see lifters get screwed by coaches who aren't adjusting accordingly for the needs of their athletes, because they're the outlier, so who cares? Or they're just not that strong, and you know, maybe the coach doesn't feel that way, but it can, as a lifter who doesn't respond well to everything, I really want to make sure that the thing I'm doing is going to work, because the variability or the variance between me having a good block and me getting hurt, it's like this, you know, whereas someone like Russ Orhe, it's like you can just throw all the volume at him, and I don't know how he does his thing, but he gets really strong. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. This is like a totally tangent question, but I'm going to say it so I don't forget it. Have you ever tried, you know, a more bottom-up system with more like a traditional Bondarchuk approach with like a single session? I've always been curious if anyone's ever given that a shot, where maybe, you know, it is just some
like one
SPD
session
variation.
repeated.
Yeah. Right.
I haven't actually, because I think the reason I haven't is, well, you know what?
Or even like multiple sessions potentially. Like 1 or 2 sessions, you know what I mean?
Corentin and I, towards the end of us working together, because like we really worked together for a while. We threw a lot of stuff into his training, like in and out. We put stuff in, pulled stuff out, and then we got to a point where like the only thing that he really wanted to do was squat, bench, and deadlift. And so he ended up implementing a lot of kind of like what Pana does, where they have like an SBD session of some degree, 3-4 times a week. But I think that's as close as I got to like repeating one session. Would it be like squat, bench, deadlift, but it'd be like singles on squat, bench, and deadlift on one day, and then it would be like fives on the other day, and then in between we'd have like a safety bar squat and bench. But like I don't know if I've ever personally, all right, we got one session, let's go, you know, for 5, however many sessions that takes for you to peak. However,
yeah,
it'd be really interesting to try.
Yeah.
I just don't know. I'm always using myself as the example when I think about that stuff, and like,
for sure,
that's a lot of training time. I mean, depending how you structure it, I guess you could do like a daily max type thing or a daily RPE8, and then the stress would be pretty low per session. That, guys, that might be the next thing. I don't know.
Because I always wondered that, because I know originally when Mike kind of talked about this stuff, he always talked about that he came back to the week just because that's what seemed reasonable. But I didn't know if he had ever had a period where he tried because that's what, from my understanding at least, that's what Bondarchuk used to do. They would have their, their weight training session that was the exact same, and then they would also have their throws, and that was the workout. And you just did the workout as many times, as it took till you reach your peak performance, and then you'd switch the workout, which is obviously a little bit more varied in like a team sports setting, not team sports, but a track and field sport like that.
Yeah.
But with powerlifting, it'd be a little bit more stagnant, but nonetheless, I think it'd be interesting, because I guess the reason I brought that up partially was some of the red flags go off in my head too, of like why that may not be practical. And I think that highlights some of the reasons we come to certain conclusions with training design, because I'm automatically thinking about enjoyment / adherence to that long term, which is one reason for periodization, in my opinion. Like that's like one reason I utilize it primarily. And then 2 would be like the load management, injury risk reduction aspect of it, which is another reason why I think, some gradual increasing of training stress, which you can still do the bottom up, undershoot a little bit at the start of the block kind of thing. That's just, I thought of that for that reason. I was like, probably not, but here's why my gut reaction says probably not. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, and back to like injury management or fatigue management or whatever it is that you want to call it. I think that's like the most underlooked, I don't know if it's variable, but like people only really know what happens if it's successful or they get weaker, but they typically forget what happens when you get injured. Like the other possible outcome to a certain training approach is that like the lifter has developed chronic pain because they've been doing the same thing for too long, or this, it probably won't happen that way. That's not really how pain works. But like if you just jump into a system and it's got a shitload of stress and volume, and the first 4 weeks they're killing it, there's not a whole lot of like the deloads or like deloads where it's just a little bit lowered at volume, they can keep going. Because that's one of the reasons why I liked bottom up training initially, because the pivot blocks were so different from what normal training blocks look like. I found it much easier to manage pain, and especially from like a lifter expectation perspective, because at least they know that once they've reached their peak, they're going to be doing something different. And I found that's really nice once if an injury happens, because I can say like, we're going to pivot that exercise early. So like if it's obviously this only works if it's bench, like a upper body versus a lower body. But like if someone hurts their pec, I'll keep the stress the same for the squat and the deadlift, but we'll pull the stress down and switch to like a 5-3-0 tempo, type of thing where they're slowing the range of motion down, or the time under tension is increased or whatever. Anyway, having that like integrated in the program now is less crazy, because what I found initially was that people are so used to like every training week looking more or less similar, even with periodized training. It's like you're doing the competition movements and variations with various volumes and intensities. But if you do like a deload where you're not even doing a competition squat, I found initially people are like, well, am I not going to lose strength? Aren't I going to, this is too different. Like I'm not used to it. You know what I mean? And getting lifters used to some relatively frequent and expected variability, which is kind of similar to just variation in the periodization models. But with the pivot blocks, it's like, this is a time specifically to recover, and we're not worried about the main lifts right now, if that's what we need to do. Sometimes it is, and so I found it a little easier to help lifters emphasize that your training, like when you think about a periodized model, it's 20 weeks, you have a 20-week training block. It seems like every session is going to then build momentum into that 20 weeks. At least it can, depending on how the coach communicates it. At least it did for me. And so it felt like if I was spending too much time away from the plan, how am I going to get to the goal at the end? Because it's 20 weeks. Now, every week I spend not doing the thing, that's time spent away from making progress towards the end goal. But when within the bottom up model, I'm able to, this is probably a flaw of my ability to coach with the other system. But it's like everything is the process, because once we're done, we're done. Like that block is finished. Now, like fully reset, recover, think about what we want to do next, have a new call, really reassess it. And at least from a one-on-one approach, and with lifters that might have more like injury tendencies or pain sensitivity, that being integrated into the system I found to be really effective for how I coach when injury is a consideration, because I do think that most people just prioritize the optimal progress, but it's like how long does that last? What do you think about that?
We were literally just talking about this today, and Zach, I think you put up a post today kind of on that exact point. So you're not going to get pushback from us on that front. I think there's different ways to like, similar to what we were talking about in terms of, overshooting top sets and how you can kind of like rectify that issue in different ways, right? You kind of outlined how within a bottom-up model, you found that to be helpful in terms of managing some of those things. In a top-down model, you could also make the argument that by like kind of biasing, I guess, the training outcome to some degree, you're less likely to kind of like, overshoot the training stress to a point that it's no longer tolerable. Again, I'm not trying to like straw man a bottom up approach. Obviously, you're doing all you can to make sure that the training stress is reasonable. So yeah, I mean, there's different ways to get there. And your point about like, if you have a 20-week training cycle, which and like, one phase potentiates the other, I think you can run into issues with that. And like Zach said, like, is there such a thing as second order effects? And like, is this actually something that's driving the actual training response in terms of like the hypertrophy I accrued during this block actually being the reason that this strength block went well? That's something we think might be a thing, but like, even if it wasn't, like, I think the way we set things up is like kind of assuming it's not in a way. And I would not be concerned if like, oh shoot, someone scheduled a meet 6 weeks from now, we have to cut this hypertrophy block short. It's not like the strength block is no longer going to like do its thing, right? It's like, oh no, we have to like, we can't do that meet or whatever because we didn't actually do the full hypertrophy block. It's not really like that. I really think it's the primary thing is psychological considerations. So like, I think within a bottom up approach, you get that right because early in the developmental block, it's kind of novel, it's interesting, and you're kind of easing in, right? And I think that's pretty common to ease in. And then by the end of it, you're pushing really hard. So you kind of get that psychological periodization within the block. Then you pivot, then you get something new again. We'll kind of do that more so on a block basis, right? Like, hey, this is your main objective for this block, is making sure those hack squats are a no shit 2 RAR, right? And then in a strength block, it's like, all right, now we're taking those top set load caps away, for example, right? Now it's time to take that extra 5 minutes to warm up for that top set. So it's really just, again, different ways to kind of get to the same endpoint or accomplish the same issue that's inherent to long-term training.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the ZAO Strength podcast. This has been the first part of a 2-part series with data-driven strength. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing it with your friends on Instagram and social media. We'll be releasing part 2 of this episode on April 28th, 2022 at 7 a.m. Central Time. So that is exactly 6 days from today. Thank you for listening and watching, and we'll talk to you in the next one.